All right, so today we have the honor to speak to Chip Berlet. Chip, how you doing today?
Hi, David. Thanks.
All right, well, we'll just jump right into it. So what were your main motivations when you decided to forego your senior year of college to pursue a career in journalism?
Well, I dropped out of college to take over with a collective, the College Press Service, which was a news service for college newspapers, as a part of an anti-war activity during the Vietnam War. Okay. So my motivation was basically listening to a speech by Dean John Rice at the University of Denver, who challenged us a year after the killings of the students at Kent State and Jackson State. The students asked Dean Rice to give a speech in commemoration of the deaths. And he asked us, what will you tell your children when they ask you what you did to stop the war? Now, I felt really moved by that. And at the time, my brother was fighting in Vietnam, and I was actually planning to be a war resistor, which luckily I got out of the draft through a legitimate, if slightly bizarre means. Not of my own making. So it was basically, I felt I had to do something concrete. I was editor of the school paper. The editor of the school paper and the student body president, Dean Rice, had a course called The Black Experience in America. So when you became either student body president or the editor of the school paper, which was the Denver Clarion at the University of Denver, he invited you into his office. He was a very large, stern-looking guy when he wanted to be. He was always large. He could be stern. He could be a lot of fun, too. And he basically said, "You're in my class." I go, "No, I don't think I am." He goes, "No, you're not listening. You're in my class." Got it. So it was a great class. We met all kinds of fascinating speakers who came into college campus like I just did. And I met Fannie Lou Hamer, the civil rights organizer who forced the integration of the Democratic Party delegation from her state in the South. And I just felt that it was really easy to be a journalist and write words against the war, and that as a person who had been brought up as a Christian and a person who believed in peace, I felt I had to do something much more concrete. So I got myself arrested with a group of other people who had already planned to, sitting in at the Denver Federal Center to stop the war, and got arrested, got into court, judge was very sympathetic and sentenced us anyway for a couple of days in jail just to, do the right thing. And it was all an amazing experience. And after that, I thought, I can always come back to college. Well, and so I ended up working at College Press Service for a couple of years, moving to Washington to be the Washington correspondent, which means, I lived in a cheap house with a bunch of other people and had a basement office with the folks at Dispatch News Service, which was slightly more funded than I was. And just sort of fell into the alternative and underground press. Never went back to college. As editor of the school paper right after Kent State, I helped shut down the school. Students took over the middle of the campus, but they weren't violent. They set up outside classes. So they had teach-ins, and so I had a lot of good music, and people were smoking those funny cigarettes. So the administration was pretty unhappy with that, as you can imagine. Yeah. So they finally called in the National Guard, and that was interesting. But Dean John Rice was the father of Condoleezza Rice, who I knew as a teenager, who played the piano. Yeah. And I think she's misrepresented him a lot, because he brought in fairly progressive and radical black activists to speak to us about basically white supremacy and the black experience and forms of oppression, and blew my head. So he actually was a progressive in Birmingham, Alabama, with his family, who had some connections with the chancellor of the University of Denver, Maurice Mitchell, who had been on the Civil Rights Commission, and I was at the time, I believe, on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And they happened in Birmingham, the Birmingham church bombing, where a bunch of young black children were killed. And Chancellor Mitchell, to his credit, called up Dean Rice down in Birmingham and said, "You come to Denver, I'll give you a job. I know you can handle it, and get your family out of there. I don't want them killed." it's kind of an amazing set of circumstances to learn as a student. So, you know, I never went back. Actually, a couple years afterwards, I got a letter from Chancellor Mitchell saying, things are really boring. Why don't you come back? I'll give you a free tuition. But I was already in Washington. And I just never went back. And then I finally, 20 years later, I got abducted by crazy sociologists who said, you know so much and you write about, as a journalist, so much about these right-wing movements with such a depth of understanding and in an odd way, respect for them. You need to write scholarly work. And that, of course, led me to the horrors of peer review, which for me was really helpful because everyone was really nice, even though it was anonymous. They just said, well, this makes some really good points, but you know, you obviously haven't read so-and-so. And of course I hadn't. And so for me, peer review was a way to do sort of remedial education so that I could actually bring my work up to a scholarly standard. So, you know, that's a couple books and 20 scholarly articles ago, and I still have a sense of humor about it. You know, I usually plug in my cassette at the beginning saying, I have no degrees, but I've been abducted by sociologists, and now I write peer review. And that way I sort of explain, I took a non-traditional route to that form of writing.
How did you first get into researching conspiracy theories in the first place?
Well, probably because I was first attracted to them. But since I'm, you know, a fact checker, and came out of a journalistic tradition, even at my college paper, the people I worked for who were the original editors and managing editor who taught me really serious journalism, they took themselves seriously as journalists, as did I, and I think student journalists should take themselves seriously, and people should take student journalists very seriously, because very often they have more ethics than the mainstream journalists, especially today. I was taught to fact check. I was taught to go over things. I was taught to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And so I was attracted by these conspiracy theories, you know, the Kennedy assassination. I wonder who did that. And the more I got into researching it, and I actually helped research a book on the Kennedy assassination called, alarmingly, The Assassination Pleas Almanac. So it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. But I actually went to the Library of Congress, which in those days was all paper-based. And you could sit in this wonderful, vast room, the main library room at the Library of Congress, which is this ornate setting. And, you know, from the various places they hide all the books and magazines, periodicals, you could order a bunch of materials to do research. And what I discovered was when I was researching some of this stuff, for the Warren Commission had researched, you had these call slips that were tucked in the publications, whether it was the New York Times Index or a book about, you know, a certain period in American history, and they were looking at assassinations and murders. And I began to realize that the Warren Commission had, in fact, looked at the attack on black people after the slaves were freed. The period of Reconstruction was replaced by a white backlash called the Redemption. And the Redemption period saw the murder of all sorts of political elected black officials, and black activists and black people of power were being killed and assassinated. Well, for reasons which, you know, I think probably was ignorance, but whatever. They listed all of those killings as killings by lone gunmen. Well, they probably were killings by one person, but they were not random, unpolitically motivated. This was an attempt to push back people into a state of oppression and the establishment of Jim Crow. These were politically motivated assassinations by people who were not crazy lone nuts, lone gunmen. These were people who were killing blacks to reestablish white rule. So I thought, well, if that's the kind of research this commission did, the Warren Commission can't be very trustworthy. And so then I began to poke into it. And a lot of the conspiracy theories then turned out to have no there. You know, you dig, and you realize that it's just a set of assumptions that aren't linked by logic. And I think for me, then I became fascinated by, well, what else is going on? And at the time, people on the American left were pretty sure the FBI was spying on them. This would be the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, but we couldn't prove it. So I fell in with a group of people called the Public Eye Network, which was founded by Sheila O'Donnell and Ida Gordon and Harvey Kahn. And we looked at all the ways we could figure out how the spying was being organized as a way of trying to see if it was happening. And, you began to talk to people and interview activists, and you'd find out that in some cases, agents would just come up to somebody, usually in the Black Panther Party or in the American Indian movement, and say, "We're watching you." And that was a form of intimidation, actually, to try to chill their speech. But that's not proof, actually. That's not something you can bring to a court. So while we're struggling to do this, a group of people, students and some faculty, in an underground cell of basically predominantly Christian-oriented peace activists, formed a group that raided the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, during some big sports event. I always forget which one. So, of course, no red-blooded FBI agent would be in the office during some big national sports event. God knows. So they basically broke in and stole the files, and somebody had set up a photocopier in a kind of a barn out somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. And they spent months photocopying all these files, and then all of a sudden they mailed them to all these newspapers. And suddenly we had the proof. We had the actual FBI documents about the program. And yes, they were spying us. And yes, in fact, they were doing pretty heinous things. So facts matter. We could prove that conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy, and it was an illegal conspiracy because we finally got down to the core documents. And so fact-checking is important. And so I became fascinated by why so many people would believe conspiracy theories if, in fact, when you sort of unraveled them, there were no facts at the bottom.
So I know you've done extensive amount of work on Lyndon LaRouche. Yeah.
My nemesis.
Yes. What similarities and what differences would you make between his presidential campaigns and the current one of Donald Trump right now?
Oh, poor Mr. Trump. It's perhaps a little unfair to compare them for
similarities and differences.
It's similar and different.
Yeah.
So, well, LaRouche is a demagogue, and I think Trump is a demagogue. It just means that they use their voice and position of power to mobilize what media studies people call using constitutive rhetoric. They build a constituency and pull it into a formation by framing reality a certain way, and that's right out of media studies these days. So LaRouche starts out with some believable claims and then goes off into this conspiratorial world that is so far out there that it sometimes seems incoherent, and I think to most people it is incoherent. I don't find it incoherent because, on a bet, if people buy me beers, I will do Lyndon LaRouche until I can't anymore, and I can usually do it for about 25, 30 minutes and a couple of beers, But then the black gulf nobility took over, and I just know so much that's parked in my brain. Trump is a demagogue, but he is of a different order, essentially. Yes, he says things that are bigoted. He says things using that exhortation voice, that builds a constituency. But in fairness, he's like a different level of out there than Lyndon LaRouche. And although interestingly, both of them seem to have had problems filing their tax returns in a proper way, and that all of us would find legitimate. In Lyndon LaRouche cases, he went to jail for tax fraud, essentially, and in the case of Donald Trump, he thinks that having bankrupted himself to the tune of almost $1 billion, was it? Or I can't remember, some huge amount. That made him a smart businessman for stiffing all those people. Not my view of being a good businessman. Maybe he thinks that's smart. So there are similarities, but they're of a different scale entirely. In fairness, I mean, as critical as I am with Donald Trump, I would not say he was identical to Lyndon LaRouche.
Would you say that there is a type or an example of a conspiracy theory that contributes to positive political discussion? And if so, what are those fundamental differences between it and a typical conspiracy theory that takes away from productive political discussion?
Well, I am the bad boy of the anti-conspiracy theory crowd. No, I don't think that a conspiracy theory that becomes a trope is useful because I think it takes energy away from critical, progressive social change organizing. And it does it by it roots people into digging deeper and deeper into a set of claims which eventually they won't find a bottom to. And so for me, that's a waste of time. I understand that a lot of people, as myself, are interested in conspiracy theories because we're interested in how power is exercised. So everyone who grabs onto a conspiracy theory starts out by wanting to change power relationships. They think, essentially that power is being exercised in an illegitimate way, which I agree. I think it is. I'm a progressive social justice, social change activist as well as a journalist. But if you then make that a cause célèbre, is proving that 9/11 was actually the controlled demolition of the World Trade Center, when the vast majority of structural engineers and scientists and material specialists say, well, no, it actually was brought down by the planes. So when you have 95% of the certified experts in building, demolition and collapse and structural matters and the melting point of steel versus the bending point of steel, and 5% saying, no, it was brought down by a conspiracy or a controlled demolition. The scientific method isn't that 100% of people have to agree. It's the vast preponderance of scientists and specialized people have to agree. So at some point, you're simply being a demagogue yourself. You're simply claiming that this is true in the face of no serious evidence and in the face of 95% of the people who spend their career studying these things saying, no, really, it happened. And we can explain how step by step. And they put out these vast volumes of how the steel began to lose its strength because of the heat. And there were all these things that happened. And, people always say, well, what about Building 7? And they show the front of Building 7. They see there's no damage on Building 7. Well, if you look on the back of Building 7, there's serious damage. They say there was no plane parts on the Pentagon lawn because look at this JPEG. Well, a JPEG is a lossy format. It means it actually finds a lot of stuff that it sees as, visual debris and it erases it to save space, right? So people circulated this JPEG that showed a very nice lawn. If you look at the original TIFF, the high resolution format of the same picture, not only is the ground covered with debris, but there's like an 18-foot long section of the plane sitting on it. Well, so people just believe what they want to believe. I saw that first image and I thought, wow, that's really stunning. I mean, something's wrong there. And then a day later, somebody says, here's the large format, high resolution picture showing all that junk on it. So there's a lot of myth making. And in some cases, conspiracy theorists, especially the demagogues, are just charlatans. Like Alex Jones. I have no problem calling Alex Jones a charlatan.
Actually
he's a great showman.
Just studied him in our class.
Did you really? Yeah, he's perfect. He's like the quintessential carnival barker conspiracy theorist.
He was selling some interesting products on his website.
No doubt. Probably gold.
Yeah.
Gold's always the answer for these people.
Yeah. So how has the conspiracist analytical model evolved with the advent and the increased usage of the internet?
I think it's a problem of introduction of a new medium. And I've talked about this, here on campus. I grew up in New Jersey, the state known for the fact that it panicked when the Martians attacked on the radio program. Radio was a new media. People didn't know how to evaluate it. So people heard this play by Orson Welles about the Martians landing or whatever, the people from outer space, and they were attacking. And they fled. They got in their cars and they drove. It was like the Pennsylvania, New Jersey kind of flat pine barren area, and people just freaked out. Because who was there? Nobody was there to say, excuse me, there really aren't any Martians here. So people then learned better. Unfortunately, with Hitler in Nazi Germany, I'm not comparing to Trump, thank you. I don't like Trump's politics, but again, difference of scale. What you have then was a person who had the perfect radio voice for the new medium of radio. If you watch him on motion pictures, he's kind of this excitable guy, right? jumping up and down. You couldn't really take him that seriously. But on radio, he sounded very charismatic for the time. And so that was an example of that moment being manipulated by a demagogue. As people become more accustomed to using a media, to being consumers of the media and the format of it, they learn to be more skeptical. And I think that we're still in a phase with the online communications, which are great. I love them. I think it is a very useful and breakthrough kind of thing that's happening in both mainstream internet, web, online systems, but also alternative media and alternative forms of communication. So I think people are a little gullible now, and I think that over time people will learn how to discard the information sources that aren't reliable. And I think you see now a lot of conglomeration of writers and editors setting up websites that have reliable information using traditional journalistic standards of ethics and fact-checking. And over time, I think more people will gravitate to that. So I think it's just, every new medium creates a period of just being lost in that media. You don't know how to consume it, essentially. And I think consumers grow up and figure it out.
Given America's revolutionary history and government-wary attitude, do you think we as Americans are more primed to conspiracy theories, believing them, compared to...
Well, if there is a considerable body of scholarly data that suggests that the revolution was built a little bit on some conspiracy theories about power in England. On the other hand, England was abusing its power. So, how do you evaluate the role of serious power struggles and rebellion, which I'm all for, and as were many of the founders, is that if people are feeling oppressed or repressed and abused by government, they have a right to rebel. Well, how you rebel and how you determine what's legitimate kind of forms of repression, oppression, versus a conspiracy theory saying, the whoever are coming, the Illuminati are coming to get you. Traditionally in this country, there's been a lot of anti-Semitism, and so it was the Jews are coming to get you. Now it's the Muslims. Trump talks about the Mexicans as rapists. An old story about claiming that those bad people are always out to get our women. Well, our women like the men own them. So it's a problem of seeing that a democracy is always in turmoil. If a democracy isn't in some form of turmoil, it's dying. There has to be some form of pushback. It has to be in a series of mechanisms where people push the society to make changes that are legitimate, and in some cases for which there's not even a consensus, but there's kind of an agreement that it's, this change is going to be inevitable, so we should just stop trying to block it. So, sure, there often are conspiracy theories that help launch people into having a power struggle with the people, with the elite powers that do exist, and often do abuse the rest of us. And separating out what's a legitimate challenge from one that's based on falsehoods or conspiracies or no evidence or no facts is part of the democratic process. And democracy depends on informed consent, and informed consent in a mass media age requires information from reliable and fact-checking journalists.
Would you say the access to so much information on the internet makes it easier for people to fall for conspiracy theories, or the opposite, to, like you said, fact-check and have informed consent?
Well, we had libraries for centuries, and people who didn't walk into a library and fall overwhelmed by the data and say, I'm going to go read, the protocols of the elders of Zion. So, no, again, I think it's a matter of people learning to be good consumers of the new kind of media that's out there. Libraries, a good library will have all kinds of information, some of which is quite shocking. And in fact, there's always these battles in towns across America where the American Library Association has to come in and go, no, the color purple is perfectly legitimate American piece of work. It's, can't throw it out and burn it. It's not okay. So it's a problem of people who see large stores of information, who find some of them offensive, feel that they can't be true to their religious or political sense of honor to allow these to go unchallenged. Whereas I come from a while I'm on the political left, I'm a civil libertarian, and I think that the free speech means free speech, and libraries should be a zone of free reading. They should have the collection that the librarian in charge feels is appropriate for the community, with a very wide stance. From left to right, all kinds of different religions, all kinds of different ethical things, and maybe some books I might call a conspiracy theory. I would never challenge a library for having a conspiracy theory book. That's what libraries are for. But I think that a librarian should be critical in terms of seeing all of that as part of the legitimate debate, and not making decisions that that's too far to the left, that's too far to the right. I know that there are some particularly bigoted materials that are sometimes kept in special shelves, or they don't collect at all. But I do know that most universities, if you dig enough, you'll find that there's a collection of horribly bigoted material that's racist and sexist and homophobic and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. And it's there for scholars to use, because you can't write about these forms of bigotry if you don't read the originals. You just can't. It's an absurdity. So I'm in favor of thinking democracy can stand a contentious set of ideas, even those that conflict with our norms and mores.
All right. Chip, thank you so much for answering these questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Berlet. I'd like to welcome you back to
thank
the
you, Daniel.
university.
Appreciate it very much.
Yeah. So I just want to get started on the questions. What is the best way to counter conspiracy theories if we see them shared online? What should people be aware of to keep themselves from falling into conspiracy theories or certain mindsets?
It's a real problem, because you don't want to come across as that crank who attacks every person who believes in a conspiracy theory. Although, Lord knows, I often become that crank, but I try and control myself. People latch onto those theories because they sincerely are concerned about, their feeling that the government is out of control. And most of these conspiracy theories are built around the government. Some of them are built around a conspiracy theory about power by a particular religious or ethnic group. Obviously, throughout U.S. history, it's either been the Jewish banker, and now it's the Islamic terrorists. Every Jew is part of a international conspiracy, and that tracks back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a hoax document and a forgery. And a lot of the stuff about Muslims today tracks back to people who are just bigots, and they don't really have any fact base to make these allegations. Any group, whether it's political or religious, there's going to be some tiny fraction of them who are people who are, really out to destroy the society and replace it with their vision of the only proper way things should run. And you really can't blame the larger group for that. It's just part of human nature that social movements often attract on their edges people who have a kind of very dogmatic and repressive view of how they want the world to function. So online, it's tough because, a flame war is online. You can come across as the person who's just a person who is a jerk, who's always slapping down any idea. I finally sort of just said on my Facebook page, I don't allow conspiracism. I don't allow bad manners and snarkiness and drive-by rants either. And I put people in the penalty box for 2 or 3 days when they don't obey. And some people then start really getting angry. And I say goodbye, thanks, enjoyed your visit. And over time, people have actually started to get that you can't call another person on my page a jerk. You can say they're wrong, but you can't say that they're an asshole. So how do you then deal with someone who you think is fundamentally flawed in their reasoning? And I think what you have to say is, I think there is a tremendous fundamental lack of actual facts that 2 or more people could fact check and find to be reliable and true. That a claim of something is not the same as a proof of something. A proof of something requires some evidence-based information that independently other people can check. So that it's often a waste of time to try and convince people. Otherwise, I usually, for people who I think are doing really good work, I'm a progressive social justice activist. If I think they're worth trying to redeem and bring back into constructive work, I'll have a conversation with them about, I get it, you're angry about how the elites work and the way that money has been sent upstairs so that the billions are raking in the cash while the average working family in America is stagnant or dropping. I mean, a lot of what Trump appeals to is a whole group of people in the upper working class and middle class who have been pushed down the ladder. They are, in fact, actually falling economically and socially, or they have a legitimate fear that they're about to. Now, are they also scared about the changing racial dynamics in America? Yes, and we can't ignore that. Are they scared and anxious about the changing gender dynamics in America? Yes, and we can't ignore that. But ultimately, these people are not our enemy. These people are not folks who are in charge of setting up the power relationships in the U.S. And really, the people who we want to treat not as our enemy, but as our adversary, are the people who believe in trickle-down theory, in my political point of view. So if somebody starts out by saying there's a conspiracy of rich people, well, there sort of is, but it's not really a conspiracy. And I'll say, well, you should go back and look at C. Wright Mills or G. William Domhoff or Holly Sklar or any of these writers who talk about how power actually accumulates and how really upstairs people are actually disagreeing all the time among these various elites and all these elite formations, so that it becomes then a matter of us mobilizing more people to object to the status quo and challenging the structures and systems and institutions of society be changed so that the greedy don't reap the benefits of their rigging of the system, as Bernie Sanders would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is there a single characteristic or trait you would give to most conspiracy theorists? What above all else just seems to unify them, in your opinion, if so?
Well, I'm going to draw a distinction between the person who I think is selling the product, and very often they are selling a product online especially, and what they want to do is say, I have the secret information about the secret elites. Oh, by the way, you should buy gold, or you should invest in this stock, or you should send money to me because I'm doing this great research. So I think those people are charlatans. And I think a lot of the people who are attracted to them are, their heart's in the right place. They know something's wrong. They have a sense that they're being abused in some way, and they're looking for what their grievance is. They have a grievance, they're not sure what it is. Now, this is basic sociology. Social movements and political movements, but social movements in particular, are built by a sense of grievance. And people learn that they share this grievance with others, and they begin to form, groups and social movements that then have frames and narratives and ways of first, basically mobilizing people around a grievance and then recruiting them into a movement. And this can also be a political movement. Often social movements are attached in a dynamic with political movements. And so to first articulate your belief that the world is run by a conspiracy of rich and powerful people, there's only one wrong in that sentence. One wrong word is that it's some kind of assumed secret conspiracy. It's not secret at all. They talk about it all the time. One of the things I always tell people is read Forbes, read the Wall Street Journal. These are organs that don't lie to the wealthy. They certainly wouldn't exist as news sources for the wealthy. So if you actually read the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and some of these other things, you'll see exactly how they construct the world. And in their view, they are the beneficent people whose creative work in accumulating wealth actually builds the jobs. This was the last presidential candidate for the Republicans, Mitt Romney, actually believed in trickle-down theory and thought they were the producers and parasites, and that they were the producers, they were the job creators. I understand that's a point of view. I don't agree with it. I struggle against it. So I think that at the top, it's a form of charlatan demagoguery and ego building by people who have a serious need for attention, who could probably get some good long-term treatment for that. But at the bottom, it's really sincere people who feel abused and are clutching at an explanation that is probably the first one they run into. And so I think at the base of all people who start to grab at conspiracy theories is a sense that they're drowning and this is a lifesaver.
How has your chosen career path been affected by your life? Have you met any really interesting people along the way?
I suspect I never had a chosen career path other than wanted to be a New York Times reporter when I went to college, and that went away really fast. I think I sort of bounced around to a lot of situations where people said, you seem to know a lot about this, come work for me. So, I worked for the National Student Association putting out a magazine after I worked at College Press Service. And when I was putting out the magazine, somebody at the American Association of University Professors sort of took me under his wing, and he got me involved in more serious lobbying and research into higher education policy, but also higher education funding. So, I then fell into all sorts of other jobs where my skills as a journalist or my knowledge I had gained working on my college newspaper, the Denver Clarion, I knew how to do paste up in the olden days before computer, typography and stuff. We actually, in '68, the Denver Clarion had a computerized typography system. It was electronic IBM typewriters. And you would input it on one machine, and then you'd take this roll of tape and put it in another machine, and it would type it out with a ribbon, I swear. And then you'd take those and you wax the back, and you'd cut them out, and you put them on a light table which shone through a piece of paper that was a graph, essentially, and you'd roll it on. And then you would take it physically, these big sheets, to the printer. And, so I became pretty adept at that. So when I was sort of under the wing of these folks in higher ed, some people said, Conservation Foundation is looking for someone to put out a book really fast. I bet you could do that. Well, indeed I could. So I fell into this stuff. Eventually, my jobs tended to be in journalism that was in the alternative press or the underground press. I ended up in the underground press. Again, because I had these skills, some people who were in the Yippies, the Youth International Party, Google Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. Anyway, the Yippies were going to protest the '72 Republican Convention in Miami Beach, and they needed a street sheet. And they said, because I had met them at a conference, they said, "Hey, I bet you know how to do this. I bet you know how you could actually have a street sheet in Miami Beach at the convention protests." And indeed, I could. I knew I had a mimeograph machine. Doesn't everyone? Because I always wanted to be able to do my own printing. As a kid in Hillsdale, New Jersey, I had a little rubber letter printing press, and I printed Goldwater flyers, AUH2O, for when I was my conservative days supporting Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. So I borrowed a friend's VW van. This is such a stereotype of the 60s, except it was the 70s. Got a VW bus, fitted it out with this mechanical, although it was also electric, mimeograph machine. Stole a bunch of paper from somebody who had kicked me out of the McGovern campaign. In Colorado, the students ran the McGovern campaign because he was not popular among the Democratic elites. And when he won the convention, people were horrified. So Gary Hart basically locked us out of the campaign headquarters, and he forgot where the paper was. So we took all this paper down to Miami Beach, and we printed it on a mimeograph machine, which was hand running. Mm-hmm. Well, interesting people. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War were there, and they came by and they said, "Could you print this flyer?" And I said, "Sure." They go, "Why are you using a hand crank on an electric machine?" I go, "Well, I'm not going to electrocute myself." He goes, "Oh, don't be silly." So about half an hour ago, a guy comes back in his, fatigues and his clamp-on shoes and his, linesman equipment, and he, takes a wire, splices on my machine, crawls up the light pole, and ties into the power main. So now I have an electric mimeograph machine. So interesting people? Absolutely. I'm always interesting people. I'm meeting them because they offer me help. So all along the way, I've met interesting people who said, "I bet you could do this," or "You can help me with that." And it's became very very kind of a refreshing way to meet people. I mean, along the way, I interviewed Edward Bernays, who wrote Propaganda. I'm that old. I had lunch with I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist. I got to be friends with George Seldes, who was in the movie Reds. Most of us who read George Seldes' work thought he had died decades ago. We're watching this movie, and there's George Seldes, probably one of the most famous muckrakers in American journalism. He goes, "Oh my God, he's alive! Where is he?" So, my wife and I used to drive up and visit him maybe once or twice a year just to say hi, because he... and once when I was studying LaRouche, I thought, really, is LaRouche really a fascist? Am I just inventing this? So I brought up some of LaRouche's materials to George, who was 98 years old, starting to shrink into himself like some elderly people do. And he's still pretty sharp. So I said, this is a favor. Could you look at some of these materials and tell me if you think this is fascistic or not? And he said, well, all right. And then he goes into the other room. We're sitting there, he always drank a martini in the afternoon. So his niece, I think, Marion Seldes, is making a martinis for us, and she comes out and she goes, "Don't tell George, but we've been watering his drinks for 20 years, but yours are real." And he comes back, he's angry, and he's waving this stuff, and he goes, "What is this? A goddamn sanity test? Of course this man's a fascist." So I thought, oh, thank you. Well, that's something, George Seldes, amazing to meet George Seldes. So, it's just, I feel a little bit like, I just fall into these things, and people have been nice and cooperative. I asked Noam Chomsky about fascism and the Weimar period at a lunch at the Z Media Institute held by the Z Magazine, a radical anarchist magazine, which Chomsky supported, and got into a long conversation, which we then kept up on the internet, sharing stuff he found. I would share stuff I found, basically taking each other seriously, which I was very blessed by. My God, he's asking me questions and I'm asking him questions. And I learned a lot from him just because he'd say, well, you need to look over here at this. Or, I would say, I just ran into this book. Maybe you haven't heard of it. And he'd go, oh, thanks. I'll read it. People, if you treat them with respect and respect them and their work, will very often respond by helping you. And it's not a manipulative thing. I think most people want to be in that kind of collaborative relationship. And, basically being adopted by a lesbian feminist academic in Chicago who said, you need to take yourself seriously, stop writing for High Times magazine, and you need to start writing about the rise of the right. And this was in, 1978, 79. I think she set up the Institute Political Research Associates as Midwest Research in Chicago in 1981. And then for 20 years, she was my mentor on a daily basis at work, basically challenging me to step up from being a journalist to being a scholar. And it was always a team. We always worked as a team. So for 20 years, I worked as a team with people who helped me be a better and better journalist and a better scholar.
Would you ever recommend your field of study to anyone, as in if a college student came to you and mentioned that they love conspiracy theories, would you advise them to sort of take a path similar to yours, or would you recommend something different?
Well, it's, I don't think there's a big market for people who deconstruct conspiracy theories. Nobody really wants to pay for it unless you're in some big think tank. So luckily, I was at a big think tank where my board, the board that oversaw the organization, said you need to address these conspiracy theories because they're diverting so much attention from serious, pushback work in progressive circles. I don't think there's a big market in it. When people ask me, should you go into journalism, I go, well, I used to get $1,000 for a magazine article. Now I get $100 if they even return my query letter or the email saying you want an article. No, I don't think there's a lot of either in journalism or scholarship, there's a lot of call for what I ended up in. I think there's a lot of call in journalism and scholarship for understanding that people who join left-wing or right-wing movements are not stupid or crazy, that left-wing and right-wing movements are serious movements. They're serious people. Neither those of us on the left or those people on the right are generally more stupid or crazy than their neighbors. sociology in the 70s, I was briefly a sociology and mass media major. In the 70s, when I first took sociology, I always thought the people who joined social movements were dysfunctional. It was the collective behavior period. People who joined social movements couldn't live within democratic civil society. We were taught. Well, that was at a time when the graduate students coming back had been in the civil rights movement, had been in the anti-war movement, had been in the women's movement at that point. And they just said, this is baloney. And so as they matured into scholars in their own right and got posts at universities, they changed the whole discipline of sociology. So now if you study left-wing or right-wing or any kind of social movement, that's considered serious sociology. So from that base, I would say absolutely, if you're looking to study these kinds of power relationships, you can do it in sociology. Certainly, my work has been accepted, even though, for me, peer review is probably a lot harder than for people who actually got a degree. But I found it really useful. People generally point out where I'm wrong or what I haven't read and should have read to write what I wrote. So my advice is definitely, as a journalist or a scholar, look at power relationships. Take people who are upset by power relationships seriously. And I think there is a career in both scholarship and journalism that is there for people who want to do that. I'm just afraid in journalism there aren't that many jobs that will allow you to put food on the table.
Mm-hmm. All right. And in what ways have conspiracy theories actually benefited society? Are there certain ways of thinking associated with conspiracy theories that have led to things that have benefited the world?
There are a lot of people who say yes, and I have a very short answer. No, I don't think so. I think that I understand that people are trying to find an answer to unequal power relationships, but I don't think, I always put it this way, can you name one successful social movement that changed in a major way the structural nature of power in a society that began with a conspiracy theory? Yeah, you could, the wise asses will say, well, the American Revolution was based on a conspiracy theory. Well, a little bit. I mean, some of the early tracts were pretty out there. I mean, some of the people who put out the first printed attacks on the British government were like the yippies of the 1700s. There's famous case of dressing up the British soldier as an ape or something. I mean, so and that became like a libel. There's a whole set of things that were pretty outrageous early on. I think most revolutionary movements that succeed probably have some conspiracy theories woven into them, but the success of them was not based on the conspiracy theories, and I don't think the conspiracy theories were a major factor in prompting them. People are unhappy because they are literally oppressed or repressed. They don't need to invent that information. They can't find work. They can't put food on their table. They can't get health care. They can't get a roof over their head. I mean, there are objective, measurable reasons why people are angry at the government today. Blaming it on Mexicans or Muslims or black people or whatever is a waste of time. Those are conspiracy theories. Blaming it on a structural defect that can be cured, to me, that is much more useful. So, no, I don't think conspiracy theories have ever created a movement and boosted a movement that really succeeded in structural changes.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever found yourself in a life-threatening situation due to your line of work? And if so, what was it?
For a long time, I didn't answer that question, but I figure, it goes with the territory. If you're going to be studying the extreme right, the ultra right, the people who carry a lot of guns and are wound up in some kind of conspiracy theory about, not only don't they like blacks or Jews or Muslims or gay people, they also don't like you. But as a journalist, I feel I have to go interview these people, and I can get along with a lot of people I disagree with. And there have been times at demonstrations when people have pointed guns at me. Luckily, when I'm at a demonstration, I tend to travel with someone who is skillful in dissuading people. Primarily, if you have someone behind you who literally has your back and is noticing somebody being threatening, just to have them step forward and go like this, often a person will put the gun down, because the Klan, when they have demonstrations, sometimes they're carrying rifles or revolvers or sometimes automatics. I grew up in a family where guns didn't scare us, so I said, oh, that's a Browning. So whatever. Yeah, I have. I've had somebody pull a gun on me and put it on the table.
Mm-hmm. And is there a conspiracy theory or theories in particular that you have found yourself leaning towards believing, ones that you find more credible than others?
Well, originally I was interested in the Kennedy assassination, but I quickly found out that didn't go anywhere. So no, I think that cured me of thinking they were real, and I never really followed them.
Mm-hmm. All right. Just want to thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you very much.
And you've been very helpful. Thank you very much.